excited. Welcome everyone to our webinar on assessment. This is a part of an ongoing webinar series on high quality dual language immersion for our youngest emergent bilinguals. In today's session, you're going to hear different terms, but we just want to clarify that we're talking about the same group of children. You might hear a term like emergent bilingual, multilingual, or dual language learner, and that means a child who's learning two or more languages at the same time during their early childhood years. You might hear a term like English learner, and that usually means a child who is learning English as a second language as labeled in the K-12 system. So we really just wanted to get started with that. And with that, we'll go to our next slide. If this is your first time joining us, or maybe not your first time, you've heard us really thank our funders. So once again, we just want to thank the funders that are making this work possible, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and the Heisen Simmons Foundation. The reason that we're having this webinar is really stemming from some of the reports that have recently been released by the Children's Equity Project in partnership with the Century Foundation. Two of these reports talk about access, which is like who is getting into the door of these dual language programs. And the second part, which is the ones that we're talking about today, is like once children are in these programs, how do they receive quality instruction? We need both access and quality to change outcomes, right? And that's really at the heart of equity. And we'll go with that to our next slide, please. And without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce you all, or to have our panelists introduce themselves. We have an amazing group of people who are experts in various aspects of bilingual assessment. And without further ado, I'm going to let them introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Duran. Do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon on the East Coast. I'm Lillian Duran. I'm a professor in the Special Education Department at the University of Oregon, and I've really dedicated the last 15 years of my career to assessment, development, measurement design, and really most recently in the last 5 years, really focused on equity-centered assessment development. So I'm really excited to share some of ideas with you today, and with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Castro.
Thank you very much, Lillian. I'm Dina Castro. I'm a professor and director of the Institute for Early Childhood Wellbeing at Boston University. I have had a long career, I think, and related to developing professional development interventions and assessing the efficacy of those interventions for young children who are growing up with two or more languages. And a concern in my career has been to measure how those interventions were really improving children's language literacy and social emotional outcomes. So, and I'm going to be sharing part of that work with you today.
Thank you. Dr. Jenkins-Franco?
Hi, my name is Jimena Franco Jenkins. Actually, it's backwards. And I'm a senior research scientist at Fram Porter-Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I have been at FPG for about 16 years, and most of my work in the 16 plus years have always been focused on dual language learners, multilingual learners. Started with early childhood and kind of expanded into doing some more work on K through 12 education at different levels of the system. So I'm happy to be here and welcome you all, and Alexandra.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Figueres Daniel. I am an assistant research professor and bilingual early childhood policy specialist at NEAR, National Association of Early Education, National Institute of Early Education Research at Rutgers University. I have also been in this space for most of my adult career. I started as a teacher in a dual immersion program here in New Jersey, and really got curious there about the process of acquisition, assessment, and quality. And so much of my work right now looks at professional development, interventions, as well as building a pipeline of Latina educators with an eye on the need for decision makers and kind of a more responsive leadership space for this population. And so I'm really honored to be here with this panel, and thank you for having me.
Bienvenidos, everyone. Thank you. We're so excited. Now, before we talk a little bit more to the panelists, we just want to remind everyone about our framework. The framework is what's guiding this conversation today. And with that, we'll go to our next slide, please. Our framework that we developed as part of the report that I previously mentioned is informed by an exhaustive research synthesis, case studies, and then expert opinions. All of the people who are represented in this panel have contributed to this report, as well as many others. And as you can see, our framework has 7 components, ranging from programmatic features, curriculum, instruction, and pedagogy. And today we're going to focus on the assessment piece. As a reminder, our framework focuses on infants and toddlers, preschoolers, and early elementary grades. And with that, we'll go to our next slide. A report has dedicated space and indicators for each section. And just as a high level description of what the assessment piece looks like, one of the things that we highlight is the need to have data-based decision making. So we don't want assessments that exist in silo or are just conducted at the child level and put in a file and never looked at again, right? We understand that in order for us to improve quality and adapt instruction for children's needs, we really need to have data-based decision-making, not only at the child level, but really thinking about what happens at the program level, at the classroom level, and then the child level. We also need assessments of children that are conducted bilingually. So one thing that we've learned is that sometimes in dual language programs, still the only assessments that are used are in English, but we know that that's not really what best practice supports. And so a high quality program will ensure that children are assessed bilingually, and also that bilingualism being one of the core qualities and reasons for having these dual language programs is that children's bilingualism also needs to be assessed over time. And last but not least, connected to the conversation from our last webinar on instruction, but also the webinar before that on language allocation, it's important to determine the implementation, fidelity, and quality of the dual language model. So these are just some things, and we're about to go much deeper, but those are some really high-level quality indicators that we're going to explore today. And with that, we're going to just turn off we have a little dance going between our slides. For this one, we won't need a slide, but I'm excited to talk about this topic. So as I was saying just a minute ago, it's really important. Dr. Duran, now, before we take a deep dive into all the levels of assessment, which I'm sure people are like, what assessments do I use? Tell me. That's important and that's coming. But I really want to take a deep dive into the types of child, classroom, and program level assessments, but more specifically, talking a little bit more about why do we need all this assessment data at these levels? And what does it mean to apply a data-based decision-making approach in a dual language setting? But can you just help us understand what in the world is a data-based decision-making approach?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So it's important that we understand what children know, that we have some measure of where they are currently, and also to look at their growth over time. We know how important it is when we look at language development to look at it over time. Language doesn't happen in the moment, language development is happening moment by moment, but it's really by looking at progress that we're able to determine whether or not children are on track. So data-based decision-making at its core means that you have points of data about that child. And there's different systems, there's observational data points, but there's also direct child assessment, which is also important. Can they do they have this at this moment? Can they do this skill? You use that information in combination, observations, parent reports, direct child assessment, to really look at, again, where that child is currently, and then thinking about where you need to bring them, what you need to do to get them to that next step.
That's excellent. And can you tell us more about what does data-based decision-making look like, specifically in a dual language setting for young children?
Yeah, in a dual language setting, you hit the nail on the head exactly. You need to be looking at both languages, right? We can't just look at one language in isolation. Our young emergent bilinguals are dynamic learners. They're going to have different levels of proficiency in each language. There are two main areas or two main contexts which influence their proficiency. One, their home language context, which includes their community. So how much English and that home language they're exposed to is going to impact their language development in the moment and over time. And then also the instructional context. What languages are used in that classroom at what frequency, right? So we know, many of us here in the panel and those out there, you might label yourself as a dual language program, but there's a significant amount of variation in how much of English and how much of that other target language, usually Spanish in the context of the US, but whatever that other target language is used across these programs. And that will also influence that child's language development, current levels of proficiency, and development over time. So in thinking about the dual language context, it's just that. You need to measure both languages and not think of that child as an isolated monolingual in either of those languages.
That's excellent. I love when things layer on each other. So in earlier webinars, we talked about a translanguaging approach or understanding of children, right? Understanding their entire linguistic repertoire. And I love what you said about not only what children need right now or what's in their environment right now, but also what is going to be their needs and environment in the future. It sounds to me like we really can't escape database decision-making, but it's not anything to feel overwhelmed by. It's just a tool or a guide, right? Like we can't throw darts in the dark and be like, it's going to work, right? We really need to be intentional, and the data guides, right, how we can tailor instruction, provide supports, professional development, etc. So thank you so much. We're going to pass it over to Dr. Castro now. I always have to say this, Dr. Castro, but when I was early in my PhD life, I read into one of her articles, Castro 2011. I have been citing it ever since. I might get a shirt. But I really liked it because it was the first time that I read something that said, kind of what Dr. Duran just shared, you mentioned that for children that are emergent bilinguals, they need all the things that any child needs, but they also need things specifically designed for them. And I thought that was such a wonderful framing for me that has guided my work. So thank you for that. And in terms of thinking about what are specific things that we should be thinking about when assessing bilingual children unique to them, what are some of those things? So like, what should we do in terms of like, what's the best thing in terms of assessing emergent bilinguals? And how do I measure quality in dual language settings? So we can start with the first thing. How do I know I'm doing the right thing for assessing bilingual children? What does research say?
Thank you very much for that introduction, Sigrid. That means that I'm getting old. I've been working on this for many years, and definitely I'm so glad that we have reached a point in the field that we can have this type of webinar and sharing with my esteemed colleagues here who have also, their influence in the field so much. We talked about, as you said, about, I would frame it as equity. We recently were discussing about how we define quality, and you're making reference to that paper of 2011, where I was calling the field attention into the definition of quality in terms of we cannot talk about quality for children who are in early childhood programs who are bilingual or growing up with more than one language if we do not recognize, acknowledge, and support their first language or their home language. So that was very, very clear, and I'm so happy that we are in that path right now. So definitely, and one of the things that, and Dr. Duran was mentioning, we cannot look at these children as monolinguals or two monolinguals in one. That's another common mistake. And then I think we have, as a field, moved into thinking about their whole linguistic repertoire as children have and live with two languages, learn through two languages. And that's why it's so important for us to assess them, talking about child assessment. If we want to know what they, not only linguistically, but in general content knowledge, we need to use both of their languages because, as I said, they learn through their two languages in life. I don't know if that answers your first part of the question. Do we need to talk
the first part for sure, and I think the second part, I think what I'm hearing you all say, it's like it's a theme. Like I try to be like, okay, what is the one thing that we want everyone to think about? And I think so far, just to reiterate what we're saying, is that we really need to define quality in the context of what that means for an emergent bilingual. And of course, that includes a bilingual assessment approach, but also understanding the children's cultures, strengths, and what they bring, right? I think that sometimes we think, okay, if there's a quality or there's an assessment that was developed for any child and then translated, for example, to Spanish, and it's appropriate. That's not exactly right. And so we just really need to center emergent bilinguals when we're defining quality. And I love what you said, that is an equity thing, right? We can't capture part of children's knowledge and think, all right, we're done now. Like that's just an incomplete measure of what children bring to the table. That's wonderful. As a reminder to all of our participants, if you have any questions or comments, or you just want to say like, that's right, please put it in the Q&A. We would love to hear your reactions and thinking as we're talking. We're now going to show the slide deck again, and we're going to transition to taking a walk through some of these program level, classroom level, and finally child level assessments. We'll start with an example of a program level assessment called the Dual Language Program Assessment, or DLPA for short. This was developed by Head Start to identify both strengths and areas of improvements across all programmatic features. And the idea is that this assessment can be used by education leaders, coaches, etc., and ideally a combination of an education team to determine the extent to which they're implementing the Head Start performing standards and how that relates to supporting dual language learners. Although it's for Head Start programs, this is a tool that is publicly and freely available and can be used and adapted to a variety of programs in Head Start, but also outside of Head Start. One thing I like about it is that it touches on infants and toddlers, a part of the universe of supporting emergent bilinguals that is also important, as well as preschool children. The language of the program itself really doesn't matter, which is nice. And then each subtest can take up to 30 minutes, maybe less. The idea is for this document to be a conversation tool, and that we can use it to, for example, for one subtest to identify like what's going really well and then what is not going as well. And I think this is really important because it highlights that dual language programming is not just what happens in the classroom, but it's all the things that are needed, the entire infrastructure to make sure that children receive comprehensive services. The DLPA has two primary domains, one called management and one called program services. We'll go to the next slide just to give you a quick overview of some of the subtests. So within management system, you have things like communication, so like how are materials communicated to families and staff, human resources, training and professional development, program planning and service system design. And then more specific to program services, we have things like education and child development that touches on all the things that most of us think about when we think of programming. So teaching, the learning environment, curricula, assessments, etc. But also some of these holistic supports such as health program, family and community engagement, and transition services from preschool to kindergarten. So programs are encouraged to focus on one thing at a time, depending on what their priorities are. But it's just a really nice tool to not guess, right? To start the conversation with some guidance and support. And with that, we'll go to classroom level assessments. We'll pass it over to Dr. Figuera. And we're going to talk about, we'll go to the CASEBA, or the Classroom Assessment of Supports for Emergent Bilingual Acquisition. Could you tell us a little bit more about what this assessment is, its purpose, and details just to help us start getting familiar with the tool?
Sure. So I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice today. So the CASEBA has been around for at least 15 years, I would say, and the purpose is to assess quality of language and literacy supports in English and a home language in classrooms with multilingual learners or dual language learners. So this is a classroom, more process structural assessment in line with other quality assessments that have been in the field for a really long time. And so the focus here is not necessarily the children, but more about the inputs from the teacher and assistant teacher in the classroom space. We have used it in mostly in preschool, 3-4 year old classrooms, but we have tried it in kindergarten classrooms, and for a current project, I am testing it in first and second grade. It takes about 3 hours to administer, and we do require that whoever is the observer be bilingual in the languages, in the target languages of the classroom. The domains cover mostly language, but also literacy, and there's lots of social emotional underpinnings to all of these pieces. All of the items and indicators are research-based. In other words, the way we got to the indicators or to the items themselves are based on the body of research for the past 20 years. And we do kind of examine it and update it often. Though that said, there's not been any major changes, given that the consensus has been fairly similar for a good period of time.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know that there's a tool specifically designed for emergent bilinguals. That's so aligned to everything we're saying so far. Thank you. Then next, we're going to talk about another classroom level assessment. So if we can go to the next slide, please. This is the linguistic interaction snapshot, or LISTEN for short. Dr. Franco Jenkins, as a hyphenated person, I am so sorry for switching your name. I know your name. I apologize, but we're going to say it 20 times by the end of today. We got it. Could you please talk to us about the LISTEN? The same idea. Tell us about the purpose, ages, language, etc.
Sure, absolutely. So the LISTEN is an observation tool, was developed by Susan Spragueman and her team in Mathematica for about 10 years ago, and it captures how language is used in early childhood classrooms. For example, it focuses on the language spoken, meaning are they speaking English, Spanish, or a mix? Is the focus child talk? Is it initiated by the child to the lead teacher, the assistant teacher, and or their peers? It also focuses on the teacher communication, the type of talk, right? Developers specifically were interested in how the teacher responds to the child and the types of talk and classroom context. So the LISTEN has been used in pre-K classrooms with children 3 to 5 years old and piloted in kindergarten or first grade classrooms, although those results have not been published. The data is collected using the time sampling approach. So you code the utterance in 30-second cycles, which are repeated 10 times. And once the code is used, it's not coded again during that cycle. So it does not give you a frequency measurement. So you observe for a total of 5 minutes, and we call that a snapshot. And you do that about 4 to 6 times because it is child focused. If you are doing a study, for example, and focusing on 6 children, you'll do child 1 for 5 minutes, child 2, 5 minutes, 3, all the way to 6, and then go back again to the first child in an effort to kind of get snapshots at different contexts throughout the day. So the domains that it addresses is oral language, and kind of get an idea of what that linguistic environment looks like and how that varies depending on the context. And to my knowledge, there's no cost for using the assessment. However, you do need to be trained in the assessment and establish reliability with a certified trainer. So in the past, developers have used kind of like a train the trainer model. Like, for example, I was trained by the developer team, and I train and continue to train data collectors in various projects when they want to use the assessment. So the training usually takes about 3 days of training, where you go through the tool, have an understanding of what, what we're being covered. And then when I was trained using practice using videos. But when I follow this train the train model, I actually do live practice observations, and also then establish reliability live. So it's not through a video. And you establish 85% interval reliability, and then you're good to go. Of course, you want to calibrate throughout as you're using the measure.
That's excellent. So it's good to hear. Now we're going to hear about one more classroom level assessment in a second, but just to reiterate, I can see like the CASEWA being more holistic, like the environment and supports, and the LISTEN getting at that teacher to child interaction. So if I rule the world, and my dream sometimes is to have a preschool program that's super high quality, I can see how both of those would be really helpful and complement each other. And the ELCO. And we can talk a little bit more at the end, like how do you layer these, or, how do I start? It can be overwhelming, but I specifically love your suggestion about the train the trainer approach and how that could be helpful in sustainability and cost effectiveness. That's also really important. Thank you. And then we'll go to our next slide. And our last classroom level assessment that we're going to highlight today is the Early Language and Literacy Classroom Observation, the Dual Language Learner Edition, or ELCO DLL for short. And Dr. Castro, can you please talk us through what the ELCO DLL is all about?
Yes, of course. Well, the ELCO DLL was developed in 2005. And so it's going to be almost 20 years in very shortly. And so we developed this tool because we had developed a professional development intervention, the Nuestros Niños program, and we needed to assess the efficacy of this intervention in changing classroom practices and child outcomes. So there were not measures existing at the time that could help us do that when we're focusing specifically on practices to support or promote language and literacy development in young bilingual children. So that was how we began working on this. And there were other classroom and overall, like global quality classroom instruments available, but not specific to supporting bilingual children. So that's how we began with this. The purpose is there then, and thinking about conceptually, how do we define quality? So it's based on research that helped us identify practices that support young bilingual children language and literacy development. So that's based on that. It can be used, is for preschool or early years. Classrooms are 3-4 year olds, and was initially developed for classrooms with English and Spanish, were spoken, but it can be used also in classrooms with other languages other than English are spoken by the children. The domains, as you see here, include literacy environment, activities, classroom observations, and a teacher interview. So it's basically, in addition to gathering information about the literacy environment, we observed. It's an observational tool, and it's about 3 hours. So this is kind of the morning in this classroom. And we include in this measure also a teacher interview that is conducted, it's short teacher interview at the end of the observation, because there are things that are not observable. And those I'm listing here. Some of them is, for example, how family communication with families happened in the classroom, how they plan for communicate, are they conducted in both languages, in orally, in paper? Well, so that's one piece. Child assessments, also procedures for the classroom, especially we want to know if there was dual language or assessments or bilingual assessments conducted, and which approaches were used. And then, of course, also we found out about approach to curriculum, planning of instructional activities, and also the use of technology in the classroom. So these instruments have been used in studies in different states across the United States, not only by our team, but by other colleagues in the field. And also there was a national study of migrant Head Start programs that use this instrument. So we have, there is a large database on this. There is a high correlation with the class, instructional support in particular, and emotional support components of class. But what we found is that when using the post interventions with and using the ELCO to measure the efficacy, we have found that the higher the scores in the ELCO DLL, the higher the scores on the class instructional support, for example. So our conclusion for that is that when you increase classroom quality to support young bilingual children, we are increasing classroom quality for everyone in the classroom. So that's one of the things that this instrument helped us determine. I think I will stop it. Now, also, we have the training. I forgot about to mention it. The training is 3 days And my colleague here, Jimena Franco, has been my partner in working with this instrument. We have worked together for many years and conducting the trainings. It's available through the training. It's for research purposes. The training is 3 days, one to go over the components of the scoring principles. And then there is a day for practice observation and debriefing, and the third day is the reliability observation, where we determine reliability to be able to use the instrument. Okay.
Thank you. No, that's helpful. I like what you said about quality. One thing that sticks out to me is when you mentioned that, through the work that you've done with the ELCO DLL, it shows that when quality goes up for emergent bilinguals, it goes up for all children. I think that's really important because I can already predict some of the pushback sometimes that we hear in the field, right? We'll hear people that say like, it's just, we don't, if we put all the resources on these groups, what about the other kids, right? But that's really the beauty of equity, when we lift up the kids that have historically and contemporarily been marginalized, everyone elevates with them, because these are things that, although are specifically tailored to emergent bilinguals, at the same time, it's just good practice, right? That everyone benefits from. And so I really appreciate you saying that. You touched upon how the genesis for this assessment came with the need for professional development. And I'd like to start asking Dr. Figueras Daniels first, how can we use some of these classroom assessments to guide professional development?
So this is what we're doing right now in New Jersey. And just to add, because I forgot a few pieces, our training is very similar to the training of the other tools for reliability and that part. So just to add that. But we are actively using the CASEBA in various projects where we do some kind of pre and post observation. We think it's very exciting that we have a statewide evaluation using CASEBA right now in New Jersey. It is 330 classrooms big, which is very representative of state-funded classrooms here, and where we will have a lot of data to bring to the surface to inform specifically professional development, how programs and districts can think about planning to use their funds for professional development in this specific area. And it's just been so important to stimulate conversations that otherwise would be invisible. And I think that's the real power of these tools. And that said, the CASEBA had been developed initially as a research kind of evaluative focused tool, and not necessarily for teachers, figuring that different things have a different purpose and a different reason. And so the CASEBA has a spin-off version called the SASEBA that is specifically made for teachers. And it's very aligned with each other, obviously, but it's not the overwhelming observation tool that a researcher would use to find very nuanced indicator level pieces. And we do generate, and we're working on generating CASEBA reports that are teacher friendly. Having been a teacher, I'm very conscientious of the need for teacher agency and voice, and the idea that teachers should be part of this process and not that this is being done to them. And so we take that very seriously. But yeah, I think the data is just so important for highlighting exactly the areas that, the process pieces that teachers, need support on, or even self-reflection. And then we do have some environmental pieces, as mentioned, that are more structural, but that data also informs the budget folks to really recognize what are the pieces that are not there that could be really beneficial for children learning, English and having, support for Spanish. Maybe that's like books or something. And so that's how we've been using it, and we find that it's very powerful.
That's brilliant, right? Like, it's almost like it's a system, right? So it's not just teachers, right? I have found that when we use database decision making, it does encourage teachers to say like, hey, I really want to work on alphabet knowledge. I notice my kids are not making gains in this area. So it's like that inherent motivation, but it also starts a conversation within administrators and higher ups to be like, all right, we're doing really great here. We're not doing so great here. And again, I just like data because I don't feel like data should be used to as a punitive tool or to say like, look at what you don't know how to do, neither to children, to teachers, to anyone really, but just be like, what are honestly like areas for strength? What can we do today that will help us? And what can we do tomorrow? It helps with strategic planning. That's excellent. We're going to transition now to talk about child level assessments. And I would like to pass it over to Dr. Franco Jenkins. And I know like one of the things that many states are doing, and we consider a good practice, right? It's like the use of home language surveys. But one thing that, I realized is that not all home language surveys are made the same, right? And just because you have a home language survey, it doesn't mean that you're doing the best. And so let's talk about what is a good home language survey. I'm going to pitch each question for you at a time, or at least I'll try to remember that. So let's get started with the first question. Well, for those of us who may not be as familiar, can you just tell us what is the home language survey? Like, what's your elevator definition?
Right. So a home language survey, it's a survey that is going to inquire about what are the languages that are being spoken at home. Now, the variability within the home language surveys, as you mentioned, it varies from asking the parents a question of, do you speak another language other than English? And that's it, which I will strongly discourage to do that, to, having home language surveys that perhaps expand a little bit more on not necessarily what home language are we speaking in the home, just the child or to the child, but also inquire about what is really the linguistic context in the classroom and in the home, right? Is the child speaking another language to you, to the other parent? A lot of, if we're focusing specifically on Spanish families, a lot of Latina families, our kids are being raised by abuelitas and abuelitos, so, I mean, are they getting the language from them? And if we only focus on asking about the mother or the father, then we're not really getting that whole context. The same with siblings. So I think that the more questions we can ask about the cultural, the linguistic, the home language, the better. But with that being said, I also think that, well, I think the next question you're going to ask me is about why is this important? So is it okay if I just go into that? Okay, great. So I think that the importance of the home language, especially for a dual language education program, it has a lot of implications, right? One is we talk about the assessment of the language, which will help educators, to understand what the kids are bringing into the classroom, right? So it's kind of like an asset-based approach. What are the strengths? What are these kids bringing into the classroom? I also want to add that the language is just not enough. And I know we're talking about a home language survey, but there's also importance of understanding the cultural relevance, right? And and having a survey that includes questions related to that cultural background that could guide the instruction that we're having in the classroom. Also, in terms of engagement with families, right? Understand what are going to be the best ways in which we can communicate with these families and facilitate that communication and strengthen that home-school partnerships. When we're talking about dual language programs, and I'll have a study in which Dr. Dore Laforet, who is on the call, actually, it's the lead, and together with Dr. Adam Winsler, in which we actually conducted language proficiency assessments. In addition to getting the report from the families, we assess proficiency in both languages, English and Spanish. And although we're still running our models and looking into our data and pushing our dissemination, to multiple audiences, our findings are suggesting that language proficiency really has an implication on resource, on allocation for program modeling. So we know in dual language programs, we have 50-50 programs, we have 90-10 programs, and we have those that go from, start with a 90-10, but then go through then 80-20, 70-30, et cetera. So with that being said, I think, we do make decisions on how do we allocate students to different models based really on resources that that school might have, because that's the reality, right? Sometimes we just don't have two teachers, to have a 50-50 model. but it's something that we really need to incorporate in guidance for school. And how do we make those decisions, because it does make a difference. And I think overall, in terms of long-term monitoring, it is important. Language acquisition is not, it doesn't happen parallel, right? So we learn English, we learn Spanish, and that changes throughout our developmental trajectory. And it is important to take into account. If we're gonna send a home language survey, we might send that language survey once a year to understand the context, but I think proficiency needs to be assessed throughout, the school year.
That's really excellent. I feel like this makes me think about policy levers. And so I know home language surveys are one of those things that states are encouraged to do, some do not. I think it would be interesting and important to develop guidance. You might be doing this already, but about like, what should states be doing, right? In terms of having and collecting home language survey, but also trickle that down to programs. I specifically appreciate what you're saying, that it's not just identifying children's home languages for the purpose of calling them or identifying them as a emergent bilingual or as an English learner, which is what's done historically, but also really to inform instruction. It sounds to me like you can't really figure out what's the most appropriate language allocation, which we don't really have time to get into, but I'm thinking it might change over time for children, and that's a conversation for another day. But it's important that we're constantly looking at the data, because one thing that we found, and that's one of the reasons that got me to think a lot about quality and language power within dual language settings, was I was realizing that even in dual language programs, there's still a power imbalance where English is the language of prestige and value, and it's also in the community most of the time. And so if we're not careful and we're not using data, it's very easy to just kind of, without intending, like causing the English to keep increasing at the loss of Spanish. And again, and that's an equity issue. So to your point, we can't separate this power dynamics and sociocultural context of language learning and language use within the home language surveys. One thing, like one of my evolutionary thoughts as a researcher and bilingual thinker, is that language doesn't happen in isolation, where you can just look at syntax and semantics and things of that nature, things that you can in an objectified way measure. But language is dynamic, and it happens within our context, within our society, within our bodies, and within our histories, right? And so I think many years ago, I didn't really care to keep speaking Spanish because I didn't want to have an accent anymore. Right now, I'm like so mortified that I thought that. But those are the kind of things that an assessment that's done well could capture. And then we could really use that as an equity tool. So thank you. Thank you so much. I feel like I was like, Dr. Duran does so much of this work of identifying language fluency and how that adapts to instruction. So it's a perfect segue for you to talk to us about the individual growth and development indicators in Espanol, and we're going to share our screen. Could you tell us a little bit more about this child level assessment?
Sure. The IGDs have a long history in the field of early childhood education. They're a general outcome measure, so they're meant to be indicators of development. So they're quick, efficient, easy to administer, and can be administered by a broad range of early childhood professionals. The English version and the Spanish version were developed. The new innovations and reimagination of the IGDs really began about a decade ago now, where we completely redesigned the measures to really think about Spanish as its own construct in terms of development. So there's no translation involved in the Spanish IGDs from the English IGDs, right? So each language develops in its own way and has different indicators of development. So the IGDs, they measure oral language, phonological awareness, and alphabet knowledge. They're meant as a complement to other assessments that you might have in place, right? So what's important about the assessment of dual language learners is also to think about multiple sources of data and over time. So this particular assessment is a direct child assessment. You sit one-on-one with the child and you go through the various tasks. We've also recently added Hmong measures. My colleague, Dr. Alicia Wackerly-Holman, has been working on that with community. So really thinking about community participatory research in order to design those items in Hmong, because it's a very different language and a different culture than either English or Spanish, and thinking about what should we target in these measures. It also does not have a history of being a written language, which makes it different when you're trying to talk about early literacy within that language. So to summarize, the IGDs are a one-on-one assessment. They take about 3 to 5 minutes to administer per measure. We have measures that include picture naming for oral vocabulary, for phonological awareness. English has like rhyming, alliteration. Spanish has alliteration. And then alphabet knowledge is this, that, letter names and letter sounds. One thing I do want to say about the Spanish development of the measure that I think it's important to highlight as we think through Spanish and any language really, that there are dialectal differences that we need to attend to. And so many assessments that are developed and on the market today, even if they are in Spanish and folks have been thinking about developing for the construct of Spanish specifically, we also have to recognize that our Spanish speakers are not monolithic. There's various words that are used across various cultures from Puerto Rico to Mexico to El Salvador. And so as part of our process of development, we actually wrote down everything that children said to our picture naming task and our expressive verb task that we have in Spanish, because turns out verbs are really important in the development of Spanish. And so we were able to capture these dialectal differences. For example, our orange card, which would be the fruit orange, right? You could say naranja, you could say china, or you could say mandarina, and all of those are correct. So I also want to highlight that as we talk about innovations, futures of dual language assessment design, is even thinking through the within group differences as we look at these different linguistic groups that we're targeting.
That's excellent. As you know, I'm a big fan of the IGDs, and I think you've highlighted something that's critical, and it's the need to have assessments developed specifically for the language that we're thinking about. And I always like to think about that the construct of what children need to know in order to become really strong language learners and to become literate in the future. That foundation is the same, right? We know that kids need alphabet knowledge, phonological awareness, oral language, things like that. But what that looks like, it's going to be different based on the language. So I really do appreciate how you and your team over all these years have really thought about like how to create an assessment that is linguistically valid. We know sometimes assessments that are just translated into English to another language create like poor outcomes for children. And we kind of pin that to children's policies instead of thinking like, is the assessment valid? Was it created appropriately for the language? And that's critically important, especially as an equity issue, where many times we are using these deficit framings of emergent bilinguals and not as often thinking about, is there something wrong with the tool that we're using? So I really appreciate what you're saying. And kind of in this idea of like, how do we create equity in assessment? I'd love to ask you another question. And this is this idea, right? Like we've talked a little bit about linguistic repertoire. So like that's one of the newer things that we're like learning about or thinking about. And maybe it's not that new, but I think we're talking about it more, at least I'm thinking about it some more. And so, we think about, for example, like children that are young, emergent bilinguals have vocabulary skills that could be spread across their languages, right? Depending on where they're learning that language. So they might know scissors as a school-related word because they're getting exposed to the word there, but a Spanish word they might know specific to their home, right? And so if we tend to assess vocabulary just in Spanish and English, not that that's not important, we're not saying throwing that away, but there's a lot of talk about how do you do conceptual scoring. So how do you measure what children know regardless of the language, just to get a little bit more of a holistic picture. So I'll talk a little bit more about conceptual scoring, specifically like, well, we'll start. What does that even mean? What is conceptual scoring?
At its core, conceptual score means that child can express the concept that they know. Let's just say the concept is dog. Whether they say dog or perro, we know that they know that word, so they can respond in either. So conceptual scoring really allows us to holistically evaluate that child's overall vocabulary based on their ability to respond in either language in the moment. and the assessment accounting for that in the responses. So counting correct whether the child said it in Spanish or whether they said it in English or whatever the other target language is. So it really allows us the freedom to not look at that child as two separate monolinguals in each language, but recognize that that child is going to draw on all of their linguistic resources in that moment based on the context, based on the image and what it elicits, based on whether they learn that word in a home or school environment. And again, it really honors their development and identity as multilinguals.
That's excellent. So what if, I'm thinking about my emerging policy brain as of 3 years ago. Yesterday was my 3-year CEP anniversary. So I'm just thinking of a policymaker who's going to be like, you're asking for a lot. You're asking us to assess a child in 2 languages. That sounds expensive. And you're now asking us to do conceptual scoring. That does not sound very standard. So what would you say to, like, imagine you're talking to a policymaker, and maybe we are, how would you, what would be your rationale? This could be open to anyone, maybe a couple of you who want to share, like, what do you think, keeping in mind this need for a bilingual assessment, for really looking at quality indicators for dual language and also conceptual scoring, why is that so important? Why is that something we should think about, even if it's hard for a policymaker?
Yeah,
Yes.
can I say one thing, Dina?
Yes,
And
yes, go
just
ahead.
to follow up on
I
the
know we're all
assessment.
too excited. I love that for
And you
us.
can definitely go.
Duran and then
To
Dr.
follow that thread of the assessment, I do want to talk about exciting innovations that are coming up the road, because some of that onus is on us as assessment developers, right? As measurement experts. I am now currently working on assessments that are general outcome measures. They will be available to the state of California through the Multitudes Project. We have an expressive vocabulary measure that has been normed, that has been psychometrically validated with children using either language. So some of that's on us to create efficiencies so that policymakers can make these decisions to adopt those assessments, to have them actually available for them to adopt, and not just in the area of assessments that are related to identifying disabilities, but these assessments that are related to instruction that are broadly used for universal screening. So I just wanted to say that before we move on, that I think it's a joint relationship between those of us providing solutions from the field and those of you who are in the position to adopt those solutions.
Thank you. We'll pass to Dr. Castro, but I just want to comment real quick. I think that's really important. And I feel like we say this in every webinar, but like none of these things can happen in isolation. I always think about like what research is getting funded, right? Who's getting funded to do the research? What research is getting published and out there, and who are the people? Like, I love all of you all, as you know, and I want, like people like us, community insiders and others, right, to collaborate to do this kind of work. And instead of doing research that is in isolation, right? Like, how do we continue to change our paradigm? So researchers, practitioners, policymakers are working together, right? To make sure that we are focusing our limited time and resources on the most impactful things that we need for the field in order to support the scalability of high quality dual language programs. So thank you for saying that. And now I'll pass to Dr. Castro. What would you tell policymakers to help make some of these assessments a reality for more children in the United States and abroad?
I think 2 things. I will start by, reinforcing that this is an effort in between those of us in the academia and those who have make decisions about policies and practices. So yes, definitely. But sometimes I think it's an effort. We have to put the money where our heart is, or where the research is, because I think we're talking from science here, and we want policies that are informed by science, and we have been, collectively, us in this webinar and others in the field for years, providing the science, and sometimes policy change is very slow as compared with the evidence that we have now. So I would just encourage policymakers to listen to the science that is provided, and we promise that we will try to, as Dr. Duran was mentioning, develop efforts that will facilitate things that will be cost effective. But above all, I think we need to, as I said, to think about the benefit and the well-being of all children, and when we make decisions. So I think that's important. And sometimes that means putting more money than what we thought. So that's important as well. So I would say that. And just talking specifically about the assessments for young children, I just wanted a little piece of clarification, because assessments are, you make decisions about which tool to use based on what you want to find out about the child. So that's very important. And I've been asked this question about the difference between conceptual assessments, or a child that was being assessed in one language and responded in a different language. Obviously, that can happen based on their experiences. But if you want to, in those cases, conceptual assessments are giving you information about concepts, so concept knowledge. But if you want to know about the level of proficiency in the language, then you have to separate, and children will fail some items. If you are assessing them in Spanish and you want to know how much Spanish they know, and they will fail some items, you need to know that. So it is just the purpose of the assessments, I wanted to emphasize, is what is going to determine which tools you use.
That's excellent. One thing, I used to partner with a program in Kansas, and we spent a lot of time just going through the assessments and creating this, I love charts. So a chart with like really figuring out, okay, what is the purpose of these assessments? Just because an assessment's available in Spanish doesn't mean that it's the most appropriate assessment for whatever you want. And so I think that's really important. So thank you for saying that. Before we end, I do want to hear from our other panelists. So imagine you have a policymaker in front of you. What is one thing you would like to tell them to help with the scalability of either the assessments that you've been working on, or just in general to have more valid assessments for high quality dual language immersion? I hate to like throw things at you, but is it okay? Like, Dr. Figueras Daniel, can I ask you first that question?
Sure. I think policymakers at the least need to really understand what the demographic, picture looks like, to understand the importance of what we're advocating for as a first step. Because I think that's what really validates the need for what we're saying, and particularly in light of other science of learning initiatives, or particularly science of reading. And so I think if we're able to kind of capitalize on some of that information, then potentially, I think, spending the money on adopting these kinds of measures. But that also, I think, alongside this issue is the need for diversification of the workforce, so that we then have people who are able to administer the assessments bilingually as necessary. And so I think it's at NEAR, we often talk about this as like a chicken and an egg issue, but they do go together. And so I think they're both something that folks need to be aware of.
Thank you. We never planned this, but every time someone says something towards the end of the webinar, it's like a perfect preview of our next topic. So our next webinar on November 15th will be about workforce training and professional development. So I didn't pay you to say that, but thank you so much. That's perfect. And so we want to end with Dr. Franco Jenkins. Now it's your turn to dream big and talk to policymakers. What will you tell them for scale of high quality?
I would just add a couple of things. One of them is, I think, my colleague, Dr. Dora Laforet, and I have been very successful in the work that we're doing, because it has been co-constructed with partnerships and the community in mind. So we started doing work on dual immersion programs, as a need and a request from a school principal that had a concern, and we went from there. And I think there's a lot of power when you try to speak with policymakers and those that are making decision makings, when you bring, yes, the data, but also these live case stories, right, on how districts make changes and improvements and what have you. So I think, there's a lot of power on this, on building and strengthening the partnerships we have with those that we serve. And then I also want to add a little bit aligned with the purpose and what Dina was mentioning, right? And I guess I lost my train of thought, but I think it was right related to that. Oh, and I guess what I was gonna add is related to the purpose is, how do we, as part of making these decisions, to plan for how we're going to communicate the findings and the audiences, because the data that we collect is only as good as we can put it out there, and that we can discern the findings on the way that people can make data-informed decisions.
That's excellent. I wish we had more time because I want to highlight, like Dr. Duran, you and your team have been co-developing an amazing assessment that takes into account so many of these things about doing it in partnership with community. I'm excited. I know I just want to thank each of you and also the collective us who have been doing this work for different amounts of time, but it's Latino Heritage Month, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that all of these amazing scholars are doctoras, which is a big deal in a field where there's not that many of us. And also just to acknowledge the progress that we've all are contributing to. I'm excited and hopeful for continued partnerships between researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and of course the community to support our children and families. As you might have said, heard us at the beginning, we do have today's conversation is part of an ongoing webinar series. We're at webinar number 5. Our next one will be next month, but if you've missed any of our webinars, you can go to our CEP website and find recordings of previous ones there. Here's the QR code to guide you to that document. And like I said before, we look forward to our next webinar and our next conversation. But muchas gracias to each of you for being part of this really important conversation. We are so grateful for you and all your work. Thank you. And to all of us, or to all of you who participated in today's webinar or who are listening at a later time, we are so grateful for your work and thank you so much for joining us. Have an amazing rest of your day.
Thank you.